Hello and welcome to Indus News. You're watching special live transmission on Indus News regarding the right to self-determination day, which is being observed by the Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control and the world over. And I am being joined by my co-host, Aiza Omar. Aiza, Kashmiris observed this day to remind the international community of their promise that they had made through the United Nations and its resolutions that the people of Indian-occupied Kashmir will be given their right to self-determination. But this promise, till date, remains unfulfilled after 7 long decades. Since Indian subcontinent was divided into 2 separate states of India and Pakistan, India has continuously and blatantly violated not the international resolutions but also the bilateral agreements with Pakistan regarding the matter. Violation of partition plan, United Nations resolutions, Simla Accord, and even its own constitution by revoking Article 370 that gave special status to Kashmiris is what India did in order to not only deprive the Kashmiris of their right to self-determination, but also subjugate them. After the revocation of Article 370, Indian-occupied Kashmir remains under continuous curfew and communication clampdown. It's been now 154 days today since the curfew in the occupied valley was imposed. The world community, including the UN, the EU, the US Congress, and the British Parliament, have discussed the India's illegal actions, but rendering only a lip service rather than taking practical measures, Aiza.
Absolutely, Avad. And what's disturbing is that it's not just these humanitarian bodies, these international organizations that have condemned the actions that are taking place right now in the besieged valley. There are 8 million people, their daily lives have come to a standstill. It's been 154 days. But in fact, even the countries that have supported, the handful who have supported India, have still come out and said that this is an atrocity, the kind of security clampdown, the communication blockade taking place. So without further ado, to examine what the fate of Kashmiris is in the days ahead of Jammu and Kashmir, let's introduce our guests who will be talking to us. We have with us Mr. Adil Najam. He's an analyst and a dean at the Purdue School of Global Studies at Boston University. Today, he's joining us from the Islamabad studios. We also have with us Dr. Malia Lodhi. She was the Pakistani diplomat, the former representative to the UN for Pakistan. She's joining us from Islamabad. And also a Kashmiri activist, Ms. Rana Shama Nazir, is joining us today from London. I want to start this conversation with you, Dr. Malia Lodhi. This issue of Kashmir, of Jammu and Kashmir, very close to our hearts because it is our brothers there who are suffering on a daily basis. And the recent 154 days have been extensively cruel to them. There have been constant warnings, whether it's from the Genocide Watch, whether it's from the Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. A plethora of organizations have come out and said this is a genocide, ethnic cleansing of Muslims of Kashmir is taking place. I want to ask you, start this conversation essentially to say, where does the fate of these Kashmiris of Jammu and Kashmir lie now?
I think we are looking at a very dangerous situation in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. As you rightly pointed out, international opinion or global opinion, if we see it being reflected by human rights organizations as well as the international media, we have seen that since August 5, the illegal annexation that India carried out of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, since then, these organizations and the Western media and the international media beyond the West have all spoken out about the atrocities that are being committed in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So we do have a situation which is grave, which is very serious, which is why in August, in fact on August 16th, the UN Security Council met. I happened to be there as Pakistan's ambassador to the UN, and it discussed the very grave situation, the threat to peace and security that was posed by this action. And this was the first UN Security Council meeting in 53 years. So you can see that a great deal of global attention has been focused on the plight of the Kashmiri people. But then, as you yourself pointed out, we still await for the UN Security Council resolutions to be implemented. And let's remember, Aiza, there isn't just one Security Council resolution. There are 11 Security Council resolutions specifically on Jammu and Kashmir. So I think what we need to do, and I think what Pakistan needs to do now, is to renew and reactivate its diplomatic campaign, because as you know, there are many other issues right now on the global agenda. There is a crisis which has erupted in the Middle East. So we, Pakistan and Pakistanis, have to ensure that not only do we continue to stand with our Kashmiri brothers and sisters in rhetoric, in our pronouncements, but also by taking practical steps so that this issue remains on the agenda of the international community.
Dr. Lodhi, as you have rightly pointed out, that it is the time for the United Nations Security Council or the relevant international organizations to impress upon India and take practical measures rather than only condemning and criticizing its illegal actions. So when we talk particularly about the Security Council, it is one of the authoritative, I guess it is the only authoritative organ of the United Nations. So what exactly the implementation mechanism it can adopt in order to penalize India for its illegal actions?
No, I think the issue is one where we have seen that for 7 decades, the promises that were made to the people of occupied Kashmir were not kept, not by the UN Security Council, not by the international community, and not by the Indian government, because let's not forget that the Indian government at that time, in the late 40s, in the 50s, had pledged to holding a plebiscite under UN auspices, because that was what UN Security Council resolutions called for. So what is needed now is for Pakistan to keep mounting a diplomatic campaign aimed at getting implementation of these resolutions. And the only way you can do that is to work very hard on the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, as well as the non-permanent members, so that they are able to see the need. Because what we have on the ground right now in occupied Jammu and Kashmir is something that poses a grave threat, not just to regional peace, but also ultimately to international peace and security. So I think this is an issue of justice, this is an issue of law, this is an issue of morality, and all of this needs to be impressed on the international community, and particularly in a targeted way at the Council. Also, we now know that in late February, the UN Human Rights Council is due to meet in its scheduled session. I think Pakistan also needs to take up this issue there to see if a resolution can be adopted by the Human Rights Council. Let's not forget again that the Human Rights High Commissioner, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has issued 2 reports already on the plight of the Kashmiri people and the human rights violations that are going on. And it also called for the setting up of a commission of inquiry which can ascertain the facts on the ground in Jammu and Kashmir. So there is much that Pakistan
Dr. Lodhi,
can use
I'll come back to you. If you kindly hold that thought over there, there should be a certainty regarding what exactly is going on and what Indian forces are doing in occupied Valley, especially after the revocation of Article 370 and consistent clampdown and communication clampdown that is there. I'll move to Mr. Adil Najam. Mr. Adil, could you, as the Kashmiris are observing today the Day of Right to Self-Determination, so it is according to the resolution which was adopted by the Commission, which was mandated by the Security Council. Could you share with our viewers about the spirit of this particular resolution? What does it exactly say, and how were the Kashmiris given the right to self-determination through a plebiscite?
I think the important part is the remembering that the real issue is self-determination. It is the issue that has lingered since 1947, which is that the people of Kashmir have the right to decide about their future. One of the things I would like to highlight is we keep pointing out rightly that it's been over 150 days, but the fact of the matter is it's been over 70 years. And the question of self-determination is a 70-year-old, not just question, but a promise by the international community, a promise by the United Nations, a promise by India itself when it took the issue to the Security Council back in the 1940s, 47, that the people of Kashmir will be given that right. And I think the significance of today and the significance of this remembrance is to not only recall, but to highlight the fact that that promise is not forgotten. And that is what I think not just Pakistan, but the rest of the world should be highlighting, that here is a promise made by the United Nations at its inception, made by India at the time of its creation, a pledge that hasn't been met. And we need to revert to that as much as we do to the events of August the 5th. Because this is a 70-year-old story. This is not just a 150-day story. 150
Absolutely.
days have been particularly
Absolutely.
brutal because they represent not just the revocation of that earlier promise, but in even further slippage.
Absolutely. Mr. Najam, here I want to bring back a question initially Jawad asked Dr. Malia here. I mean, you rightly pointed out this has been going on for more than 154 days now. I mean, this is a 7-decade-old dispute. But then it really begs the question that an organization like the UN, where does it stand? What is the point of its very existence if a resolution that cannot be implemented even 7 decades later by those who had endorsed it in the first place? I mean, what jurisdiction does the UN have here?
We have to understand the United Nations, and Dr. Lodhi knows this much better than I do, and she can, I hope, also add to it. But remember what the United Nations is. The United Nations is a voice of the international community. So when we say that the UN has done or not done something, we are not talking about a building in New York. We are not even talking about the office of the Secretary General. We are talking about the international community. And I think that's where this conversation has to happen. The UN is the forum, but the conversation has to be global. That conversation has to be held in every capital, at every point, at every moment, because then only it will reflect in the United Nations proper itself. And I think that's the challenge. And if I might add one thing here is that in the events of August 5th and after that, this renewed attention that has come to Kashmir, I think there has to be a new momentum of action, certainly by Pakistan, certainly by the people of Kashmir who have kept the issue alive for this long period, but by the world. And what I mean by that is that until then we had gotten into this sort of state where the conversation was that this is something to be decided between India and Pakistan.
Right. And that conversation seems to have taken a break now because of what is unfolding. Sorry, Mr. Najam, to interrupt you there, but that conversation, I want to just take that forward to Ms. Nazir and get your comments here on this. Something that Dr. Malia Lodhi has also highlighted, there is a paradigm shift. The way we have seen in the past decade, the conversation over Palestine versus Israel, that paradigm shift, the Zionist regime and the kind of atrocities and the illegal occupation, that conversation has finally got the recognition where Israel is seen as the perpetrators here. Do you feel like these past 150 days, as horrible as they've been for the Kashmiris, we might have just witnessed that positive paradigm shift in the world community?
Hello, sorry, who's the question for, sorry?
Yes, can you hear me, Ms. Nazir? This question was for you. Hear me?
I didn't hear the question, but what I'd like to say, I would like to say thank you for your efforts, your prayers, your tears, and your love for sharing your support and solidarity for the people of Kashmir, and also for Malia Lodhi. I know that for many years, I've heard the name through my uncles and also Najam. We appreciate this. We can't even bring ourselves to feel the pain and suffering of the families in Kashmir. Many of them, they have seen nothing but violence and conflict in their lives, and they've been scarred with the suffering. And in fact, the very first UN resolution, which was passed in 1947, it related to the plight of the Kashmiri people and asserted their right to choose their leadership. And yes, very true. It's been going on for over 70 years, since I was a child watching this. This took place at the end of the British rule in India, and it's been a festering wound, and left since then a result of, the deals made at the time. And the one protection they did have was the Article 370, which at least protected the identity of Kashmiris by banning land and property ownership, as well as residential right to non-Kashmiris. So the removal of this article by the Hindu nationalist BJP government was followed by the suffocating curfew in the Himalayan region, and the snapping of phone internet connections. The Indian, the Indian government, they say we're trying to unite and strengthen. They have this argument, the territorial integrity of India. So why has it deployed hundreds and thousands of Indian troops in this region for the past, since I've been a child, been hearing about this?
Right.
Because the reality on the ground is that Modi's government is actually changing, as we know, the region's demographics by forceful means. Even men in India, they've been encouraged to flood into the region by sickening adverts, the fair-skinned Kashmiri women, the land which they now own, causing terror and fear in the population. It's a social and political genocide that's been unleashed in Kashmir now, which has been going on for over 70 years. And the appalling physical brutality that has been endured by the Kashmiris, it brings tears to my,
But Ms. Nazir, just to interrupt you there, do you feel like from the time when you were a child and witnessing all of this, do you feel like now the conversation in today's world, especially since the revocation of Article 370, that there has been some kind of shift in how the world sees the world's biggest democracy, India?
Yes, India being the largest democracy after, Mahatma Gandhi, you think, he'll be turning in his grave. Obviously, he was Mahatma Gandhi. He was born only, to talk about peace and democracy. And the Modi's fascist regime, it's sickening, it's horrific, it's upsetting, tragic, very disappointing. And seen from a country like India, where these leaders were born like Mahatma Gandhi. So it's, India is seen to the world as a leader of democracy who itself has 200 million Muslims, also Christians.
So, Ms. Nazir, you're of the view that the current tactics which are adopted by the Indian government are in direct contravention to the ideology of Gandhi and Nehru. Even their own ministers in the current parliament have gone to the extent of blaming their own forefathers of having done a grave mistake by taking this dispute to the United Nations. But it's been a couple of months that the leader of the opposition in Rajya Sabha, Ghulam Nabi Azad, went to Indian-occupied Kashmir. And he made startling revelations about the ground situation over there. So it's been a couple of months now. Nothing is coming out of there. Can you get any sort of contact with anybody on the ground in Kashmir? What is exactly the status with the Kashmiris now, as there is brutal cold and also the brutalities from Indian paramilitary forces unabated?
I have friends and relatives over there which I've not heard from. A dear friend of mine just recently, her father has passed away. She has had no communication with him. And can you imagine what it's like? She's not spoken to her father, and then all of a sudden she hears that he's passed away. So it's children their tongues have been cut out because they are not allowed to recite the Quran, so they're making them recite the Hindutva chants. The horrific things that are happening inside and what we're seeing is just horrible. And these are just a few journalists who are just outside of, in India who are getting this information. It's just India's government, it's turned back the clock. It's crippled Kashmir's viability as a modern state. Imagine the internet being shut down in the UK. We can't even imagine. It's unthinkable.
Exactly, Ms. Nazir, that was exactly the point which was made categorically on the platform of the United Nations General Assembly session by Prime Minister of Pakistan, that consider some 80 million animals being put into a sort of a prison, and what kind of hue and cry would be made in the world, across the world, by all the quarters. But over here in Indian-occupied Kashmir, 80 million people had been under consistent subjugation. And I will take this point to Dr. Maliha Lodhi. Dr. Maliha, as Mr. Najam had already pointed out, that United Nations is only the platform where the international voices come and discuss the international issues. there has to be discussion almost in every corner of the world, but there have been discussion in the European Parliament. The United States Congress has discussed this situation after the revocation especially, and then the Amnesty International has also criticized this particular thing. How do you think Pakistan and the international community can take more proactive measures in order to stop these brutalities?
Well, I think you were referring to the ground situation. I think that has exposed India, and it has exposed the phoniness of so-called Indian democracy. If the world's largest democracy denies democratic rights to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and indeed to all minorities within India itself, including Muslims, particularly Muslims, then what kind of a democracy is this? This is a sham. So I think India is exposed by its own actions, by its atrocities, by the fact that in occupied Jammu and Kashmir there are still midnight raids that are going on, where children are whisked away in the dead of the night, where torture has been documented by reputable international human rights organizations. So the situation is grim. Now, when you say what else can Pakistan do, Pakistan has run a vigorous diplomatic campaign since August, in fact, if not before, but certainly since August. I think, as I was saying before, it needs to renew that campaign, because for the last couple of months, clearly Pakistan has been focused on other issues as well. But I think the time has now come, and there's no better day than today. The notion of self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter. It is a fundamental human right. It is something that actually the UN Charter starts with the three words, we the peoples. And what does that mean? That means people everywhere must have the right to determine their own destiny. So I think to renew that campaign at the Human Rights Council, at the UN in New York, as well as work the diplomatic capitals, send out special envoys to key countries, and I think continue to engage with human rights organizations, invite members of the international community who have spoken out on human rights violations in occupied Kashmir, invite them to visit Pakistan, invite them also to conferences that can take place in key capitals, and they don't just have to be in the West, key capitals in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, because look, you need the support of the entire international community if we are to get anywhere to ensure that justice is done to the people of occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And I will say that one day justice will be done, because might is never right. That principle.
Very wise words indeed, Dr. Malia Lodhi. Mr. Najam, coming to you here, as Dr. Lodhi has highlighted the world community, that this conversation needs to keep going. But it's surely not just Pakistan's responsibility to keep open this conversation, to bring the voice of Kashmiris of Jammu and Kashmir to the forefront. Cannot the world community that actually recognizes the atrocities that the Indian government is now doing on Kashmiris, can it not reach out to the ICC? Can they not approach them for a vote to, get ICC involved in this?
It's not only Pakistan's responsibility, but I do think Pakistan has a special role in this. I think the greatest impact has been from the people of Kashmir itself. And if I look at, all of international history in the last century, this is a very, very startling and important example of a people through multiple generations, despite the occupation by India of a large part of Kashmir, keeping the issue alive at a level that one might not have expected. And therefore we need to recognize that. But there is this responsibility for the whole world. As I was saying earlier, I think we need to, the answer is this: internationalize, internationalize, internationalize. This has been an international issue. It is more of an international issue. And if anything we should be reminded of from the events of even this week, it is that we are in a dangerous world, and the rest of the world should pay great attention to make the world a better place for all of its people. Otherwise, all the hot spots that we have that keep growing are only going to make this planet an even more dangerous place. So whether Pakistan goes to the ICC, whether Pakistan goes, we should, I think we should apply all options. Bilateral, multilateral, United Nations, every organization. To the extent that there was an argument that Pakistan and India should try to resolve this, if we could, very good. But that should not be an argument for not doing anything, especially after India has in fact unilaterally thrown out the similar accord.
Right, absolutely. But Mr. Najam, the counter-argument to that, Mr. Najam, has been that any kind of efforts to mediate have been thrown out the window. Also, when we saw the US President Trump meeting with Prime Minister Khan in July earlier in 2019, all efforts of mediation were taken very negatively by Prime Minister Modi. I mean, there was a whole ruckus about Trump having misquoted Prime Minister Modi even after that. I mean, so I guess the question what I'm trying to ask you here is, while mediation seems out of the window here, it seems that the world powers don't have any stake in Jammu and Kashmir. So why would they put all their efforts behind resolving a conflict that's been ignored for 7 decades?
Yes, but they will get a stake if... Yeah. Yes, and so how do you change that? You do that by consistently, repeatedly, persistently raising this issue in every conversation. I do not think that you should expect that someone will say, yes, we will mediate, and the Indian Prime Minister will say, okay, sure. That won't happen. It will happen only if you consistently beat on this point in every international conversation. And I think that is the responsibility, certainly of Pakistan to begin with, and then of other countries to also join. But you cannot expect to just wait until the Indian side unilaterally says, okay, now we are ready. That is what won't happen. And the importance of today, as well as the importance of these 150 days, is the reminder that this is too big an issue for us to just shelve on the side, I mean the world, to just keep on the side and hope that time will heal it. We have now had 70 years, time won't heal it. And therefore it has to be persistently kept on the international agenda, despite all the distractions that we are seeing, including the distractions of this week.
Right, absolutely. Very good point there. Mr. Najam and Dr. Lodhi, we want to have this conversation further on after this break. We were joined by Mr. Rana Shama Nazir. Thank you so much for your input on what is happening there in Jammu and Kashmir. With that, let's take a quick short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Welcome back on Indus News. We are doing the special live transmission regarding the right of self-determination day today, which was given through the Security Council resolution to the Kashmiris. But after 7 decades have passed, this promise remains unfulfilled. We had been joined in the earlier half of the transmission by Dr. Malia Lodhi, the former representative of Pakistan at the United Nations. Now we've been joined by Major General Ijaz Awan, defense analyst, and also Mr. Zafar Qureshi, chairman of the Kashmir Campaign Global. I will resume the discussion with you, Major General Ijaz Awan. We were having a little bit of a discussion regarding the mediation effort which was made by President Donald Trump to India and Pakistan in order to resolve this crisis. How do you think Pakistan can use leverage in this particular thing? Because obviously the United Nations has got the interest in Afghanistan, is very much dependent on Pakistan regarding the Afghan peace process.
Well, thank you very much. I do not take that offer very seriously, the offer which was made by President Donald Trump, because there is no equation between the two. The American interest in Afghanistan vis-a-vis American interest in India. So I would say the scale tilts very clearly in favor of India when the United States and Indian interests are seen in the region. Afghanistan is one situation where America has decided to pull the troops out, and they are about to leave. So I don't think American offer was very meaningful or has some tangible outcome. I do not foresee it, because they would like at best to maintain status quo in the region, and they would, if at all they have to help the two sides, they would rather be helping India as compared to Pakistan. I would keep the American interest or American desire, which has always been there. They have already sided with Pakistan, or they have kept Pakistan with good hopes when India was aligned towards Russia or was completely non-aligned. But now, since India has shown their card and they are tilting towards America, America would go for a much sought-after ally in the region, that is India and not Pakistan. So therefore, I don't think America has something solid to offer with regard to resolution of the Kashmir situation in the light of United Nations agenda.
Major General, that's a really good point. Also, in terms of, while we understand the kind of relationship that exists between the US and India, historically so, and the kind of up and down we've seen with Pakistan and the US, but if one were to look at the Islamic countries, if we were to just look at the OIC, what, in your opinion, is holding them back in pursuing if nothing else, an economic sort of tactic to pressurize India to take a step back on the kind of atrocities that it's perpetrating in Jammu and Kashmir?
Well, it's a very unfortunate situation that OIC has never been able to assert itself as a forum, or it has not been able to defend the Muslim Ummah's interest in the region, whether it's in the Middle East or in Kashmir. So they have not been a very strong and assertive voice with regards to the rights of the Muslims of the subcontinent or in the Middle East. So they have always pursued their economic interests more rather than the interest of Ummah as a whole. But this was one issue which had the backing, which had the guarantees, and there was a provision of plebiscite in the UN resolution, but none of them came openly to support, and whenever there was a movement in this step, they stepped back and they never really stood out with Pakistan with regards to Kashmir.
All right, thank you so much, Rajaz Awan there. Coming to you, Mr. Qureshi, I want to highlight here that while Prime Minister Imran Khan spoke about 4 key issues in the very now famous speech in the UN General Assembly in September 2019, his one key point, besides Kashmir, was the kind of sentiment that now exists towards Muslims across the world, Islamophobia. Do you think that Islamophobia, the kind of presence it's made itself, been felt in not just the West, across Europe, but now also in Southeast Asia, do you feel that is also what is making it difficult to resolve this issue?
Jazakallah khairan for this opportunity. Indeed, I think the narrative that the world's creating regarding the Islamophobia is having one of the key impacts on the issue of Kashmir and the Muslims in South Asia. India and the extremist fascist government ideology of RSS, they've set up media cells which have always been trying to create a narrative and associate the peace-loving struggle of the peace people of Kashmir, the just struggle for right of self-determination, into an extremism or terrorism. What they're trying to do is capitalize the psychophears in the West about Islamophobia and associate that with Kashmir and taking that into terrorism. And the same has been applied for the Muslims across of India. Right, so anything that has been done, they label it as Muslim terror. So of course, it's having an impact in Muslims in general of South Asia, particularly our struggle in the Indian-occupied Kashmir, which is rightly for the right of self-determination. But unfortunately, India is trying to associate it with the Islamophobic terrorism.
Mr. Shi, is there any sort of an understanding within India about the actions which are taken by the BJP-led government that follows the Hindutva ideology and also follows in the footsteps of the RSS? So there was a point made by Pakistan's Prime Minister in his speech at the UNGA that these tactics or this Hindutva ideology might put this region into a sort of a nuclear conflict. So how seriously some quarters within India take this warning seriously?
Among the Muslim population, so I've been in touch with some of the Muslims in India, and I think the fear within the Muslims is growing every day, and not just now. It's actually the other minorities within India have started thinking on, are they safe within? The prosecutions that the Indian Muslims are facing, as well as the policies of this fascist government in trying to blame anything that goes wrong across Pakistan, there is animosity being created between the two countries and that has been capitalized by the BJ government. I think there's a real threat that's been felt on the ground that if the international community does not get involved and take tangible steps to de-escalate and get the rights of the minorities, especially Muslims, back in, it is possible that it could lead to a nuclear flashpoint.
Okay, Mr. Zafar Qureshi joining us, Istanbul, the chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global. Thank you very much for your time at Indus. I'll move on to Dr. Malia Lodi. Ms. Lodi, when we talk about Myanmar's army's war crimes which were taken at the International Court of Justice, and the United Nations has categorically denounced these actions by the army in Myanmar against the Rohingya community. So is there any option on the table as far as Pakistan is concerned to take this matter at the International Court of Justice?
I think Pakistan needs to examine all diplomatic and political options. I think its focus really should be on the Human Rights Council in Geneva, because that is due to meet end of next month in February. I think we need to establish through a resolution international support for what the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has already called for in 2 reports, which is to ensure that there is a commission of inquiry into human rights violations and the atrocities being committed by occupied forces in Jammu and Kashmir. So I think that should be one of the areas of Pakistan's focus. At the same time, we need to remain active in working the capitals of all 5 permanent members of the Security Council. We need to aim also for the Security Council to examine the possibility of expanding and strengthening the UN force that exists and that is charged with monitoring the line of control. As you know, the situation on the line of control continues to be very fraught. There are ceasefire violations being committed by Indian forces. In fact, there is targeting of civilians on the Pakistan side of the line of control by Indian forces. So I think this also needs the attention of the international community, and therefore Pakistan must renew its call to the UN to strengthen what is called UNMOGIP, which is the UN Military Observer Group for India and Pakistan. This is an important group because it can report to the Security Council about who is doing what on the line of control. So I think there are several options for Pakistan. The question really is that what is the game plan, what is the strategic plan that Pakistan has, because
Dr. Lodi,
the aim
you talk
surely...
you about this a lot of how this, especially this meeting of the Human Rights Council end of February, Pakistan should really avail this opportunity. But if I could ask you to spell it out a little bit, especially in today's sort of significance that this holds, you know, the UN resolution 7 decades later stands at null and void. Nothing has happened, even though the UN spokesperson has spoken about the kind of draconian measures, the UN repertoire has spoken about the kind of draconian measures the Indian government has taken part in. But what kind of efforts? I mean, what kind of leverage does Pakistan even have in this forum to try and convince enough countries on its side to push this at the top of the agenda?
Pakistan has considerable international support. I think we should also look at the upcoming meeting, I hope, that will take place with the Saudi government's offer to hold a ministerial meeting of the OIC. I mean, these are all diplomatic levers. They all have to be used. And I think you don't give up. Just because something hasn't happened over decades doesn't mean that we throw up our hands in despair. No, it should renew our resolve, because the grit, determination of the Kashmiri people should be before us, their courage, their bravery, their resistance, the fact that they've always said no to Indian occupation, that we should take courage from. And I think Pakistan is in a position where it can, as I said, renew a vigorous diplomatic campaign so that we raise the diplomatic costs for India for the kinds of actions that it has taken in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Look, at the end of the day, we stand with the people of Jammu and Kashmir. We must do all that we can. We must use every forum. We must use every platform. We must go to every government that we can go to ask them to stand on the side of justice, to stand on the right side of history. This takes a lot of effort, I agree. But diplomacy is not an event, it's a process. And often it's a long, laborious, and painful process. But we owe this to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, that we continue to stand with them and we continue to speak for them and we continue to be their voice wherever we can raise our voice.
Dr. Lodhi, definitely very inspiring words there. What we've actually seen, especially since February, I would say, 2019, this conversation that the Pakistani government, not only the Pakistani government, but the expat community around the world, Kashmiris, Kashmiri diaspora, the protests we've seen outside Washington, outside different world capitals, Downing Street, all talking about the same thing, that give the Kashmiris the right to self-determination. But here, does it worry you, the kind of events that are unfolding on the world stage involving the Middle East that might possibly take away, once again, the spotlight from what is, at the moment, as Genocide Watch says, a ethnic cleansing taking place in Jammu and Kashmir?
Well, of course, I mean, this is going to be a greater challenge, I think, for Pakistan, because with world attention being focused elsewhere, naturally, what we're looking at is a very, very serious crisis that is building up in the Middle East, which has implications for Pakistan as well. I mean, the last thing Pakistan would like to see is a conflict in our region, in the Middle East, involving one of our neighbors. So certainly, this magnifies the challenge for Pakistan. How do we keep the world's attention focused on Jammu and Kashmir and the plight of the Kashmiri people at a time when the world is obviously also preoccupied by this new flashpoint for conflict, as well as other long-running conflicts that are going on that also attract the attention of the international community. So this is a diplomatic challenge, and it's a challenge that we must live up to.
Absolutely, a challenge we must live up to, not give up hope. Diplomacy, like you mentioned, it's not an immediate event. It's a process. It has taken 7 decades for sure, Jawad, and this day, the way we are talking about it here on our media platform, it is a conversation that is not just restricted within Pakistan. There's a huge Kashmiri diaspora that is talking about this time and again. I mean, reports coming out of Jammu and Kashmir talk about 13,000 detained and their whereabouts are not there. So it is very disturbing that when unconfirmed reports talk about that these are conservative estimates, that we should be talking about more like 40,000 Kashmiris with their whereabouts not known.
Exactly, Aiza. Now we have been joined by Mr. Arif Kamal, former ambassador from Islamabad. Mr. Arif Kamal, thank you for joining us at Indus Special live transmission regarding the right to self-determination day that the Kashmiris are observing today. And it's been over 150 days since India imposed curfew and the communications blackout. How do you see how significant this day is and how the world can be once again reminded that the promises made to the Kashmiris were not fulfilled even after 7 decades?
Well, I think this is the time for us to reaffirm the Kashmiri primacy in the triangle of dispute and not to limit it to India-Pakistan dynamics. If we do so, we have our efforts that are already being made will be very much fruitful and quantifiable. And if we don't give Kashmiris a face, an institutional framework to speak and to articulate whatsoever is their case as the principal party, then I think we have another long inning to go. I'm not saying another 7 decades, but I think it's not always advisable to run the cases on the basis of a wakalatnama. It has something which relates to human dynamics. And if it's a question of self-determination of a people more than the population of the entire Gulf states put together, then it is our primary responsibility in Islamabad to refurbish the Kashmiri face as a unity in diversity, as a juridical entity in its own right, in spite of whatsoever may be the fragmentation caused here and there. And if we do so, I am pretty sure that this would fulfill the call of this day. This is, in short, my point of view.
Right, Mr. Kamal, as you have rightly pointed out, so there are so many things which are supposed to be done in Islamabad on this front. Rather than rectifying its belligerent attitude in occupied Kashmir, Indian government has resorted to alienate Muslims within India itself. How do you see those developments? A lot of protests are going on every day, and the people are being arrested. A couple of dozens of killings, indeed, have been carried out by the Indian police within India as well.
Well, this fascist manifestations in the Indian mainland have, in fact, eroded the Indian posture. Certainly, there is more worldwide attention towards the duality and of whatsoever is the play of the fascist tendencies in the Indian whole. But then let's not take it as a Hindu-Muslim scenario in India. It is the play of the fascist tendencies, and there is people besides and in a trans-ethnic and a trans-regional and across the faith systems who have stood up and have questioned the BJP's, the Saffron India's tirade against the Muslims. And therefore, I think we need to strengthen those voices at the international forum and in whatsoever are the pronouncements in Islamabad.
We need to strengthen our voices at the international fora. Pakistan really relentlessly and repeatedly and persistently needs to highlight this issue of disputed Jammu and Kashmir and the atrocities being committed by India over there. Mr. Arif Kamal, former ambassador, thank you for joining at Indus News Special Transmission. Either freedom or azadi that we translate when in Urdu, that is the thing which can't be snatched either by subjugation or by force.
Absolutely.
So that is what exactly India had been doing over the last 7 decades. But there has to be a threshold to those brutalities and those atrocities by Indian forces and the Hindutva ideology, particularly manifested by the BJP government.
It's playing out. It's playing out on the world stage. The world is recognizing the kind of right-wing extremist activities that the BJP government is carrying on. From the protests, you mentioned the protests in India, over 25 people have been killed by security forces for voicing their concerns about disenfranchising the Indian Muslims. But what we can say for sure, the key takeaway from this conversation we've had with our experts is that hope is something we cannot afford to let go of. And it is Pakistan's responsibility to continue this conversation, to make the world leaders turn around and listen. That, yes, right now, over 100,000 Kashmiris have been killed. Documented events have proven this. This is not a disputed figure at all. So, but we have to keep this conversation going so that the world leaders finally do take action.